David Johnson had always prided himself on being the perfect husband and father, but on Christmas Day, everything shattered. Linda, his wife, had spent the morning preparing the holiday meal, unaware that the man she once trusted with her life was slipping into a darkness that would soon consume them all. Their 3 children, Emma, Jack, and little Lily, had no idea that this Christmas would be their last, that the man they loved would destroy everything they held dear. In an instant, David made a decision that would change their lives forever. Pinecrest was a small, picturesque town nestled in the heart of the country. The streets were lined with charming homes that seemed to have been plucked from a postcard. The houses were surrounded by tall, snow-covered trees, and the air was crisp with the faint scent of pine and wood smoke from chimneys. Christmas lights twinkled in the early morning, adding to the festive ambience. The town was quiet, except for the soft crunch of snow beneath boots and the occasional car driving slowly down the road. On this particular Christmas Day, everything seemed perfect. The whole town was covered in a blanket of snow, and the world felt as if it had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of the holiday. The Johnson family's home was just like any other in Pinecrest, or so it appeared. Inside, the house was decorated with meticulous care. The living room was cozy, with a large, beautifully adorned Christmas tree in the corner, its lights casting a warm glow. The fireplace crackled softly, adding to the serene atmosphere, while the smell of cinnamon and roasting turkey filled the air. The family was gathered in the kitchen, excitedly preparing their traditional Christmas breakfast. The children, 12-year-old Emma, 9-year-old Jack, and 5-year-old Lily, ran around the house, their voices full of excitement as they unwrapped gifts and eagerly showed off their new toys to their parents. It was a scene many would envy, a happy, loving family, enjoying a peaceful morning together. David Johnson, the father, stood by the stove, flipping pancakes with a forced smile on his face. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of the perfect husband and father. He worked as a mechanic at a local shop, where he was well-liked by everyone. He had a wife who loved him and 3 beautiful children who looked up to him. Yet, despite the outward appearance of happiness, David felt an overwhelming pressure building inside him. For months, he had been struggling silently with financial troubles. His job as a mechanic, though steady, didn't pay nearly enough to cover the mounting bills. The bills had piled up, and every month seemed to bring more problems than the last. He had tried to keep it together for his family, but the weight of it all was starting to crush him. David's wife, Linda, moved around the kitchen, setting the table and preparing breakfast with a quiet sense of purpose. She, too, was trying to maintain the appearance of a happy family, but even she could feel the tension. For months now, their marriage had been slowly falling apart. There were arguments, some loud and some quiet, but the love they once shared had faded into something more distant and fragile. Linda had always been the backbone of their home, but even she was beginning to feel the cracks. The constant struggle to make ends meet, the growing distance between them, and the unspoken frustration had taken its toll. Still, she smiled, determined to make this Christmas morning a happy one for their children. She didn't want them to feel the strain. The children, oblivious to the tension between their parents, ran through the house with laughter and joy. They were excited, like any child would be on Christmas morning. The presents under the tree had already been opened, and the excitement was palpable as they played with their new toys, their faces lighting up with happiness. Emma, the oldest, was already organizing her new art supplies. Jack was busy trying out a new video game, and little Lily had found a stuffed animal that she immediately began hugging tightly. The house was filled with the sounds of innocence and joy. David watched his children play, his smile growing more strained as the morning wore on. He tried to feel the happiness that was surrounding him, but it seemed so far out of reach. He felt detached, like an observer rather than a participant in the moment. His mind was elsewhere, filled with dark thoughts he had not shared with anyone. Thoughts of how he had failed his family, of how the weight of his failures was unbearable, how he couldn't provide the life he had promised. Despite the warmth of the house and the love of his family, David felt cold inside. His mind was already drifting into a place of darkness, a place that would soon change everything for them all. As the hours passed on Christmas Day, the Johnsons' home remained filled with the joyful sounds of children playing and parents pretending everything was normal. But the cheerful atmosphere couldn't hide the cracks that had begun to show over the past few months. Beneath the surface of the holiday festivities, there was an undeniable tension, one that neither David nor Linda could escape. David had always been a proud man. He'd worked hard his entire life, determined to provide for his family. But lately, despite his best efforts, nothing seemed to go right. His job as a mechanic at the local shop, once a steady source of income, was no longer enough to cover their growing bills. He had been forced to take out loans to make ends meet, and every time he thought he was getting ahead, something would set him back: an unexpected car repair, a medical bill, or a broken appliance. It felt like an endless cycle, and the weight of it was crushing him. He had tried to keep up appearances, to maintain the role of the provider, but deep down, he felt like he was failing. Each day, the pressure mounted, and it became harder and harder to mask the fear and shame he felt. Linda, too, had her own quiet struggles. She had always been the rock of the family, the one who held everything together while David worked long hours at the shop. But over time, even she had started to feel the strain. Her marriage, once built on love and shared dreams, had begun to feel more like a routine. The arguments, which had once been rare, had become more frequent and more intense. She had tried to talk to David, to understand why things had changed, but he had become distant, closed off. He no longer shared his worries with her. Instead, he buried himself in his work, spending long hours at the shop or working on side projects, trying to earn a little extra money. But the emotional distance between them grew wider, and Linda felt more alone than ever. The children, innocent and unaware, could sense the change in their parents, though they couldn't put it into words. Emma, the eldest, had become more quiet, retreating into her books and art. Jack was increasingly irritable, his once carefree spirit replaced by an edgy restlessness. Little Lily, the youngest, seemed the least affected, her world still full of wonder and innocence. She was content to play with her new toys, her stuffed animals, her little world untouched by the strain that hung over her parents. That afternoon, as the children played and Linda cleaned up after the Christmas meal, David found himself alone in the living room. The weight of everything, his financial troubles, his failing marriage, his overwhelming sense of failure, began to press down on him. He sat in the armchair, staring blankly at the Christmas tree. The lights twinkled, the colors vibrant against the backdrop of the snow outside, but David couldn't find any joy in it. All he saw were the gifts under the tree, the ones he had promised his children, the ones he had worked so hard to give them, and it all felt meaningless. He had tried so hard to keep it together, to give his family the Christmas they deserved, but now it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. The walls felt like they were closing in. He couldn't escape the constant pressure in his chest, the gnawing sense of failure that seemed to grow with each passing day. His thoughts, which had once been clouded by doubts, now turned darker. He couldn't see a way out, couldn't see a future where everything would get better. In the quiet of the living room, David realized something that scared him more than anything else. He was on the edge, and he didn't know how to stop himself from falling. Linda entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. She smiled at him, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. David tried to smile back, but it felt like an effort. She asked if he was okay, but he only nodded, telling her that he was just tired. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before she returned to the kitchen, and David was left alone again. As he sat in the dim light of the room, his mind grew darker still. The more he thought about everything, about the mounting debt, the constant strain, the feeling of being trapped, the more the idea began to take root in his mind. It wasn't a thought he had entertained before, but now it felt like the only way out, the only way to end the pain. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds of Christmas cheer in the Johnson home began to fade into a distant hum. The children had become tired from the excitement of the morning, their energy slowly draining as they played quietly with their new toys. Linda had gone to the kitchen to start preparing the holiday meal, humming softly to herself as she worked. The house felt warm, the kind of warmth that usually brought comfort and safety. But for David, it only deepened the suffocating feeling that had taken root in his chest. He had tried to push his thoughts aside, to act as if everything was fine. But now, with the house quieting down, the weight of everything he had been hiding seemed impossible to ignore. David stood in the living room, staring at the Christmas tree. The soft glow of the lights made the ornaments shimmer, and the scattered gifts beneath it were a testament to the hours of work he had put in to make this day special for his family. But as he gazed at the scene, it felt like an illusion, a mask he could no longer wear. The pressure he had been carrying, both financial and emotional, had become too much. His mind had been racing all day, and the thought that had been lingering in the back of his mind now took hold fully. The sense of failure he had been hiding from everyone, the crushing realization that he could no longer provide the life he had promised, had become overwhelming. The love he had for his family, his children, was still there, but it felt so distant now, as if he were watching from far away. Linda called out from the kitchen, asking if he wanted to help set the table. David's response was automatic, as simple, "I'll be right there," but his feet didn't move. Instead, he stood there, frozen, in front of the tree. The idea that had begun to form in his mind earlier in the day now felt like the only escape. The idea of ending the suffering, of ending it all for everyone, seemed strangely peaceful. For the first time in months, David felt like he could breathe, like there was a way out of the endless cycle of fear and shame. He turned and walked out of the living room, his feet heavy on the floorboards. He made his way to the garage, his hands trembling slightly. He had never been the kind of man who would consider such an act, not until now. The tools and old equipment in the garage had always been a source of pride for him, his tools, his space. But today the garage felt different. It felt cold, stark. The rifle was in the corner, tucked away behind some old boxes. He had never used it much, only for hunting in the past. But it was there, always there, a silent reminder of a different time. David walked toward it, almost mechanically, his hands reaching for the cold metal. As his fingers wrapped around the barrel, a strange calm settled over him. For a moment he stood there, still, the weight of the gun in his hands, and a rush of thoughts flooded his mind. His children, Emma, Jack, Lily, they were everything to him. He loved them more than anything in this world. Linda, his wife, who had been his partner, the mother of his children. But despite the love he felt for them, everything seemed so broken, so beyond repair. The burden of his failure had become too great. His failures as a father, as a provider, as a husband, felt insurmountable. He couldn't see a way out, and the thought of disappointing his family even more seemed unbearable. The idea of ending the pain, of somehow making it stop, grew louder in his mind. David took the rifle, his hands shaking less now, but his heart was racing. He walked back into the house, his mind clouded, each step deliberate but heavy. Inside, the children were in the living room, quietly playing with their new toys, unaware of the storm that was brewing just outside. Linda was finishing up in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared the meal. The warmth of the home contrasted sharply with the coldness David felt inside. He stood at the doorway, looking at his family, and for a moment the thought of what he was about to do seemed surreal. But the darkness in his mind, the weight of his despair, kept him moving. The gun in his hands felt oddly familiar now, like it was the only thing that could give him a sense of control in the chaos. As he walked toward the living room, his heart pounded, each step louder than the last. This would be the moment that would change everything. He had made his decision. There was no going back. David stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, the rifle heavy in his hands. The sounds of the children laughing and playing in the living room seemed to echo through the house, a sharp contrast to the pounding in his chest. His mind was clouded, swirling with conflicting thoughts. He loved them. He truly did. But in this moment it felt like there was no other way to escape the crushing weight of failure, the suffocating fear that had gripped him for so long. The future he had imagined for his family, stable, happy, carefree, felt as distant as a dream. All that was left now was this dark path he had convinced himself was the only solution. The children were blissfully unaware. Jack was building something with his new Legos, his little hands moving quickly, trying to get the pieces to fit just right. Emma was sitting by the window, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights as she flipped through the pages of her new art book. Lily, the youngest, sat on the floor, her stuffed animal clutched tightly to her chest as she hummed softly to herself. They were everything to him, yet they seemed so far away now, as if the walls of the house had become an impenetrable barrier between them. The warmth of their laughter, the innocence of their voices, it felt like a cruel reminder of the life he had failed to give them. Linda, in the kitchen, was humming along to a Christmas song, her back turned to him as she stirred the pot on the stove. She had no idea what was unfolding in the living room, no idea that the man she had shared her life with for so many years was standing there, holding the rifle. David's hands tightened around the barrel, his knuckles white with the effort. He tried to steady himself, but the trembling wouldn't stop. He wanted to call out to Linda, to tell her everything that had been building up inside him, to tell her that he was sorry, that he didn't know what had happened to him, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like there was a wall in his throat, blocking everything he needed to say. For a brief moment, a flash of clarity broke through the fog in his mind. He looked at his children, their faces full of innocence, their laughter filling the room. He thought of their futures, their dreams, their hopes, and the crushing guilt began to rise. How could he do this to them? How could he rob them of their chance at happiness, of their future? He wanted to be the man they believed him to be, the man who would protect them, who would give them everything they needed. But that man was gone. In his place was a stranger, a man so lost in his own despair that he no longer knew how to find his way back. David took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath him. The rifle felt heavier with each movement, like a weight he couldn't shake off. He could hear Linda's voice from the kitchen, calling to the children to wash their hands for dinner. He hesitated just for a moment, but in that moment something inside him snapped. The clarity, the moment of doubt, faded into the background, replaced by an overwhelming sense of finality. The decision had already been made. There was no turning back. As he walked into the living room, the children looked up, their faces lighting up with smiles. Emma waved at him, her eyes bright with excitement as she showed off a drawing she had made. Jack glanced up briefly from his Legos, his face filled with curiosity. Lily, oblivious to anything amiss, giggled and hugged her stuffed animal tighter. The sight of their faces should have been enough to stop him, but it wasn't. All he saw was a future he had failed to protect, a future he had ruined with his own hands. David stopped in the middle of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't bring himself to look at Linda as she walked toward the doorway, sensing something was wrong. For the briefest of moments, everything seemed to slow down, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The laughter of the children, the hum of the stove, the warmth of the house, it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else in a different world. And then, in that heavy silence, David raised the rifle. Linda's voice called out again, but this time it was too late. The noise, the moment of impact, everything happened so quickly, too quickly for anyone to fully comprehend. The house, once filled with laughter and the sounds of Christmas joy, was now eerily silent. The warmth that had wrapped around the Johnsons like a comforting blanket was gone, replaced by a chilling coldness that seemed to seep into every corner of the home. The rifle, once held by David with trembling hands, now lay forgotten on the floor, a symbol of the unspeakable tragedy that had just unfolded. Linda had rushed into the living room at the sound of the shot, her heart racing, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. She had barely reached the doorway when she saw David standing there, the rifle still in his grasp. The shock on her face was mirrored in the eyes of the children, who were still too young to understand what was going on. Jack had dropped his Legos, his face frozen in confusion. Emma stood still, her wide eyes locked on her father, her mouth slightly open, as if to speak but no words coming out. Lily, too young to comprehend the danger, was sitting on the floor, staring at the chaos unfolding in front of her. Linda's first instinct was to move, to protect her children, to somehow shield them from the horror that had just shattered their world. But it was too late. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. Her body moved in slow motion as her eyes darted between David and the children, unable to grasp the reality of it all. Her heart screamed inside her chest, but no sound came from her lips. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and before she could process what was happening, the overwhelming sense of disbelief took over. She rushed to the children, her arms instinctively reaching out to gather them close, her hands shaking as she held them tight. Emma, usually so composed, was trembling in her arms, her face pale with fear. Jack, still not fully understanding the magnitude of what had happened, looked up at his mother with wide eyes, his face frozen in a mixture of confusion and horror. Lily, oblivious to the danger, clung to her mother, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of Linda's sweater as she sobbed uncontrollably. Linda's gaze never left David, her heart breaking as she tried to process the man she thought she knew, the man she had built a life with. He stood there, his eyes distant, as if he were no longer present in the room with them. He had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. But now he was a stranger. The man who had promised to protect his family had become the very thing they needed protection from. Her heart shattered as the realization sunk in David was beyond reach, and nothing she could do would bring him back. The sirens outside grew louder, a stark reminder that the nightmare was just beginning. Neighbors, who had been celebrating their own Christmases in the warmth of their homes, were now stepping outside in confusion, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. Their peaceful town, so full of life and cheer just hours before, had been forever changed. Linda held her children close, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest as the world outside seemed to swirl in chaos. She didn't know what would come next, how to explain to her children what had just happened, how to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. All she could do was hold them, to try and shield them from the reality of the situation. David's mind, clouded by the haze of his actions, seemed to be unraveling even more with every passing second. His hands were shaking, his body tense, as if he had just woken up from a nightmare and couldn't believe what he had done. He looked at Linda and the children, but his gaze was vacant, unfocused. He had acted out of a desperation he had never expressed to anyone, a desperation that had ultimately torn his family apart in the most irreversible way. The flashing lights of the police cars and ambulances filled the windows, casting their red and blue hues across the walls, a stark contrast to the peaceful Christmas decorations that still remained in the house. The officers rushed inside, their voices cutting through the silence as they assessed the situation. They spoke to Linda, asking questions she could barely process. Her mind was numb, her body in a state of shock. She could barely speak, her words coming out in fragmented whispers. She was only vaguely aware of the officers taking David into custody, his hands cuffed behind his back as he was led out of the house. His eyes were empty, his face devoid of any emotion. It was only when the officers began to speak, their words filled with confusion and horror, that Linda realized the full extent of the tragedy. David hadn't just harmed himself. He hadn't just caused irreparable damage to his own soul. He had wiped out his family in the most literal and devastating way possible. And now, as the reality of what had happened sank in, Linda understood that the life she had known, the family she had built, was gone forever.